Okay, so I want you to imagine a symbol of suffering. I mean, the ultimate symbol of vulnerability. A man stripped, beaten, and nailed
Wow.
to a piece of wood to die a slow, humiliating death.
Right.
That's the cross. In its original context, it represents the absolute lowest point of human powerlessness.
It's an image of total defeat. Or, at
Yeah.
least it started that way. It was basically the Roman state saying, we can do whatever we want to you.
Exactly. We have absolute power. But now, now I want you to take that wooden cross and mentally forge it into iron. Sharpen the edges. Turn it into a weapon.
A sword.
A sword one used to conquer nations, command armies, and enforce obedience. That transformation from the cross of Jesus to the sword of Constantine. It isn't just a metaphor. It's the central image and the title of the massive book we're unpacking today.
And it's a transformation that, according to our author, planted a seed that would grow into a 2,000-year tragedy. It's really the pivot point of Western history.
We're doing a deep dive today into Constantine's sword, The Church and the Jews, A History. It was published back in 2001 by James Carroll. And, looking at the sheer weight of this text, literally and figuratively, this feels like way more than just a standard history textbook.
Oh, it's so much more than a textbook. It's a dual genre work, which makes it fascinating to analyze. On one hand, you have this sweeping, comprehensive history of Catholic-Jewish relations spanning 2 millennia. It's dense with dates and edicts.
On the other hand,
It's a deeply personal memoir.
because of who James Carroll is, right? He's not just an academic looking in from the outside.
Exactly. Carroll isn't just a historian looking at dusty scrolls in a vacuum. He's a former Catholic priest. He's a novelist, a cultural critic. He taught at Harvard Divinity School. But mostly, he writes this as a man in the middle of a spiritual crisis. He's a believer who is horrified by the history of his own institution.
And that's what creates the tension that drives the whole book. We're not just looking at dates and battles. We're watching a man wrestle with his own identity. He's trying to reconcile his love for his faith with this horrifying history he feels the church has buried or ignored.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. Because this book makes such huge, provocative claims, we can't just, nod along. We need to apply our comprehensive book critique framework to it. We need to test Carroll's arguments, separate the historical facts from his emotional opinions, and really look at the logic holding it all together.
So let's start with a core thesis, the narrative arc. Carroll is not subtle here. He's effectively drawing a straight line from the New Testament to the gas chambers.
He is. It's uncomfortable, but we have to look at it squarely. Carroll argues that the Holocaust, the Shoah, it wasn't just some freak accident of the 20th century. It wasn't just the work of a few madmen in Germany or a sudden burst of secular hatred.
No, he says Christian anti-Judaism is rooted in the earliest gospel narratives and was systematized over centuries.
Right. So he's saying the groundwork for the Holocaust was laid in the Bible itself.
He's saying the mindset was laid there. Now, we have to be precise. Carroll explicitly disclaims inevitability. He isn't saying the Gospels forced Hitler to exist.
But he insists on the connection. He argues that without the church spending centuries conditioning European culture to see Jews as the villain or the other, the Nazis could never have succeeded. The soil was prepared by the church. The Nazis just planted the seed.
That's a heavy charge. So if we're mapping these claims to the evidence he presents, where does this story actually begin? Most people think of the early Christians as the victims, hiding in catacombs.
Carroll takes us right back to the 1st century, and this is a key insight for you listening. He views the Gospels not just as divine revelation dropping from the sky, but as what we might call wartime literature.
Wartime literature, that puts a very different spin on it.
Well, you have to remember the context. The temple in Jerusalem has been destroyed by Rome. The Jewish community is fractured, traumatized. You had the Jesus movement on one side and the Pharisees on the other. They were like two brothers fighting over an inheritance.
Competing for the title of true Israel.
It was a bitter family feud. And Carroll argues that to win that argument, the gospel writers embedded an anti-Pharisee mythology into the text. They painted the Pharisees, and by extension, the Jews, as hypocrites, villains, and enemies of the truth. It was a polemic. It was intended to separate the new sect from the old establishment.
Which might have just been name-calling at the time, a minority group shouting at a slightly larger minority group.
But then the power dynamics shifted.
And it's the moment everything changes. The title of the book, Constantine.
The turning point, 312 CE.
The Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Emperor Constantine is fighting for control of the Roman Empire. He claims to see a vision of the cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer.
He puts the cross on his soldiers' shields, and he wins.
And just like that, the symbol of the executed criminal becomes the symbol of the executioner.
Precisely. Christianity goes from a persecuted sect to the state religion of the most powerful empire on earth. And this is where Carroll zooms in on a detail that I found fascinating, the story of Constantine's mother, Helena.
Right, her trip to Jerusalem. This sounded almost like, an Indiana Jones expedition.
In a way, it was. In 326 CE, Helena goes to the Holy Land and discovers the true cross at Golgotha. Carroll argues this wasn't just an archaeological find. It fundamentally shifted the focus of the religion. It amplified the passion story, the physical suffering and death of Jesus.
And if you focus entirely on the death,
You have to focus on who killed him. This solidified the charge of deicide God-killing. For centuries, this became the lens through which the church viewed Jewish people, not as neighbors, but as the people who killed God.
and Carroll traces the body count that followed this shift. I mean, it's not just theology, it's physical violence.
He does, and it's a grim timeline. Really grim. He moves to 1096, the First Crusade. Most people know the Crusaders went to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, but Carroll points out that their first victims were often Jewish communities in the Rhineland.
The logic being,
What?
if you're going to kill the infidel abroad, why not start with the infidel at home?
Then you get the Black Death in the 14th century.
Where Jews were accused of poisoning wells. That's the blood libel, the idea that Jews were literally consuming the blood of Christians or destroying Christian society from within.
And then the Spanish Inquisition. And this is where Carroll notes a really terrifying shift, right? It stopped being about what you believed.
Yes, this is crucial for understanding the bridge to modern anti-Semitism. In Spain, they introduced the concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Even if a Jewish person converted to Catholicism, it wasn't enough. The stain was in their blood.
So it's no longer about theology, it's about biology.
Exactly. Carroll sees this as the direct precursor to modern racial anti-Semitism.
Which brings us inevitably to the 20th century. To the silence. The infamous silence of Pope Pius XII. Carroll critiques the Vatican's response to the Holocaust. In 1943, Jews were being rounded up in Rome, literally blocks away from the Vatican walls, and the institutional church did not intervene. He frames this as the culmination of that 2,000-year history.
It's a damning narrative arc. But Carroll doesn't just list these events. He tries to explain the why. He dives into the theology. And he uses a term that we should probably unpack. Soteriology.
It's a $10 word for a pretty simple concept. How are we saved? Soteriology is the study of salvation. And Carroll's argument, and it's very controversial, is that the church's obsession with atonement theology is the root of the problem.
This is the idea that Jesus had to die to pay a debt for sin.
Right. If the central mechanism of your religion is Jesus died for your sins, then the death is the most important part. And if the death is the most important part, then the agents of that death in the gospel narrative, the Jews, become the ultimate villains. You can't have salvation without the killer.
And that leads to supersessionism.
Which is essentially replacement theory. The idea that the church replaced Israel as God's chosen people. Carroll argues that as long as Christianity defines itself by replacing Judaism, anti-Judaism will always be part of its DNA.
Okay, we've laid out his case. It's powerful and it's emotional. But this is a deep dive, and we promise to test this book. So I want to step back and use the Adlerian lens. Mortimer Adler talks about distinguishing between opinion, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. How does Carroll's book hold up when we separate these things?
It's a vital distinction here because the book blends them so seamlessly. Let's start with knowledge. The historical facts Carroll presents, the dates of the Crusades, the edicts of the Inquisition, the silence of 1943, these are established knowledge, they're verifiable, you can go to the archives and check them.
But the connection between them, saying theology caused the Holocaust, that's not a fact.
No. That moves into the realm of opinion. It's an informed opinion, certainly, a powerful argument, but it is not an empirical fact in the same way the date of a battle is. Historians debate the causes of the Holocaust fiercely. Carroll is taking a very specific stance that emphasizes religious history over, say, economic or political history.
He also does something really interesting where he imagines a road not taken. He brings up a theologian named Pierre Abelard. This felt like a huge what-if scenario.
It's the great counterfactual of the book. Pierre Abelard was a 12th century theologian, and he preached a different kind of soteriology. Instead of focusing on the blood debt or the legal necessity of Jesus dying, Abelard focused on the love of God. He argued Jesus lived and died to demonstrate love, not to pay off some cosmic bill.
And Carroll's thinking,
Yes.
That if we had listened to Abelard, we wouldn't have had the Holocaust.
He speculates, and remember, this is pure speculation, that if the church had followed Abelard instead of the hardliners like Anselm, the obsession with the death of Christ might have faded. And if the obsession with the death faded, the hatred of the killers might have faded too.
It's a beautiful thought, but completely unprovable.
Totally unprovable. But it shows Carroll reaching for understanding. He's trying to find the systemic pivot points. He implies that history wasn't inevitable, it was a series of choices. He also shows deep understanding when he discusses papal ambivalence.
Obey.
He notes that popes were often the ones protecting Jews from mob violence, while at the same time writing the laws that marginalized them. He understands that the church wasn't just a cartoon villain, it was trapped in its own logic. It wanted to be the one true faith, which required suppressing rivals, but it also claimed to be a religion of love. That contradiction created a kind of schizophrenia in the institution.
So where does wisdom come in? If wisdom is knowing what to do next, what does Carroll propose?
He proposes a Vatican III, a new church council. He calls for a radical rethinking of the cross and a total rejection of supersessionism. He wants the church to explicitly say, we did not replace the Jews. Our covenant does not invalidate theirs.
That sounds noble, but I see a massive tension there.
It's the tension of identity. Is this wisdom or is it destruction? If you remove the centrality of the cross and the uniqueness of Christ, is it still Christianity? Or have you just created a nice, polite, ethical society that isn't really a religion anymore?
That is the paradox. Let's shift gears to the ethical side of things. We always like to apply the golden rule test. Would I accept this treatment?
And this is where the history Carroll documents just fails miserably. The Crusaders, the Inquisitors, the silent officials in the Vatican, none of them would have accepted being marginalized, displaced, or killed for their faith. It's a profound failure of reciprocity. The church demanded freedom for itself while denying it to others.
We also look at the distinction between needs and wants. How does that apply here?
It is stark. In this history, the Jewish communities had a fundamental human need. The need for physical security, for survival, for dignity. The church had an institutional want, the want for theological dominance, for dogmatic purity, to be the only way.
And the want crushed the need.
Consistently, for centuries. The institutional desire to be right was prioritized over the lives of the minority living in their midst. It's a warning for any ideology. When your desire for purity overrides someone else's need for safety, you have lost the ethical plot.
Carroll also brings up some civic standards. He talks about concepts from the preamble, like establishing justice and domestic tranquility.
He does. On establishing justice, Carroll is demanding accountability. He says you can't have justice without admitting the wrong. You have to look at 1943 and say, we failed. You can't just sweep it under the rug of history and move on.
But domestic tranquility, that usually means keeping the peace.
And here it cuts both ways. On one hand, admitting these faults could heal the relations between Catholics and Jews. That's a form of tranquility. But internally, inside the church,
it would be chaos.
Exactly. Radical theological changes cause chaos. If the Pope were to announce tomorrow that the traditional view of the atonement is wrong, it would likely cause a schism. It would destroy the domestic tranquility of the church itself. Carroll is effectively asking the church to risk its internal peace for the sake of external justice.
That's a big ask. Now, before we wrap up, I want to put on our logician hats. We said we'd test his logic. Where are the gaps in Carroll's argument?
Well, Carroll writes with the passion of a novelist, and sometimes passion jumps over logical hurdles. The biggest potential fallacy here is post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore because of this.
Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Right. Just because Nazi anti-Semitism happened in a Christian Europe doesn't mean Christian theology was the sole cause. Nazi ideology was a toxic brew of pseudoscience, social Darwinism, nationalism, economic scapegoating. Carroll admits this, to be fair, but the emotional weight of his book pins like 90% of the blame on the cross.
It feels like he's saying if you fix the theology, you fix anti-Semitism, which might be oversimplifying human nature. People find reasons to hate each other without theology.
Exactly. And there's also the composition fallacy. He treats the church as a single character in a story. But the church in medieval Spain was very different from the church in early Rome or the church in modern America. He risks ignoring the diversity of thought that always existed to make his narrative fit.
Okay, but there is one area where his logic seemed pretty strong to me, the systems thinking.
Yes. Carroll avoids ad hominem attacks. He doesn't just look for bad guys, he looks at bad systems. He argues that Good people, devout, prayerful people, did terrible things because the system of belief conditioned them to. That is a sophisticated argument. It removes the monster myth and replaces it with the banality of evil concept.
So bringing this all together, we have a book that's part history, part memoir, part theological manifesto. It's been about 25 years since it was published. How does it stand today?
It stands as a monument to the paradox of reform. Carroll argues that Christianity must risk its identity to save its moral soul. He believes that if the church doesn't excise this anti-Jewish root, it has no moral standing in the modern world.
But the dilemma remains. If you pull up the root, do you kill the tree?
That's the question he leaves us with. And he doesn't pretend it's an easy answer. He acknowledges that what he's asking for is a dismantling of 1,500 years of tradition.
Let's crystallize this for you listening. If you're walking away from this deep dive, what are the 3 key insights you need to hold on to?
Insight number 1, the ethics of memory. Carroll teaches us that confronting historical wounds like the silence during the Holocaust is a requirement for justice. You cannot build a moral future on a buried past. We have to look at the ugly parts of our history to heal them.
Insight number 2.
The distinction between needs and wants. The history of anti-Judaism is a textbook example of an institution prioritizing its want for dogmatic purity over a minority group's need for survival. We see this pattern in history constantly, not just in religion, and this book highlights it devastatingly.
And the 3rd.
The danger of causal oversimplification. Critical thinking requires us to accept the horror of the history without necessarily accepting that theological doctrine was the sole cause of modern crimes. We have to be able to hold 2 thoughts at once. The church failed, and the Nazis were driven by other factors as well. Nuance is the only way to navigate this.
It's a complex picture. And here's a final provocative thought for you listening. We talk about institutions evolving. But if a religion fundamentally changes its core doctrines, like the meaning of the cross, to correct the historical wrong, does it evolve into a more perfect version of itself? Or does it become something entirely new? Is it the same ship if you replace every plank?
That's the question Carroll is wrestling with, and it's one we all have to answer when we look at tradition versus morality.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
A pleasure.